A proposed US tax bill in Trump's Big Beautiful Bill has added another source of uncertainty for international investors. Section 899, which has come to be called the revenge tax, is seeking to increase tax rates on countries whose tax policies the US deems discriminatory. And I'm pleased to be joined by Cameron Gleeson, Senior Investment Strategist at Betashares, to walk us through this proposed tax policy and what this might mean for Australian investors in US assets. But before we dive in, a quick disclaimer that all tax information in this video should be considered general purpose only. So let's start off, Cam. First question, what is Section 899?
Great place to start. So Section 899 is titled The Enforcement of Remedies Against Unfair Foreign Taxes. And this provides the White House with a new tool, a new tax that they can levy on foreign investors that hold US assets of up to 20%. Now, specifically, the way that this new tax will work is that if the US Treasury determines that a country is unfairly taxing US companies, then that country will be added to a list of unfair or discriminatory tax countries. And there'll be an additional tax of 5% placed on the income generated, US income generated, which goes to investors and companies from that country. That will then increase to 10%, 15%, and 20%. So it's really designed to target investors and companies from that country. And we think it will be used as somewhat of a negotiating tactic as part of the sort of landscape where we sit with tariffs and all sorts of other international policies.
Great, Cam. And can you walk us through the impact that this has for particularly Australian investors in US assets, such as equities and bonds?
Yeah, this is a question that we've had come up a lot. So, for most people who might be listening, they may be an Australian investor and they might have access to investing in the US through, say, for example, a managed fund or an ETF that holds underlying US equities. Now, the way that the tax will work, Australians currently do pay withholding tax on dividend income, which is generated out of a portfolio of US equities. Currently, due to tax treaties, that's at a rate of 15%. This new tax will be levied on top of that withholding tax, so an additional 5%, for example, in the first year, if Australia is added to the naughty list, will be levied, and that will come out of the income generated by the underlying equities, and that will basically come off the distribution of the ETF or fund. I think it's important to note when we sort of talk about investing in US stock markets, most Australians would suggest that their predominant driver for investing in the US would be capital growth rather than income. Typically, the US equity market yields just over 1%. So while this is a bad outcome for equity investors, it's probably not diabolical.
Great, Cam. And what about investors in US bonds or funds?
Yeah, so foreign investors in US bonds, that's a really important source of funding for the government and US companies. There's actually a note within the bill that says that interest income, which is currently exempt from withholding tax, should also be exempt from this bill. Now, I will note that several senators, because the bill is currently up in the Senate, have asked for clarification, and the final bill will be subject to amendments, but it's probably unlikely that fixed income interest will be captured by 899, and so that should get a clear run through, and we shouldn't see any tax drag as a result of holding bonds, US bonds.
Great. Now, with the tax currently in the Senate, do you think it's likely to pass? And do you think it will be applied to a country like Australia?
This bill seems to be receiving bipartisan support, unlike other bits of the One Big Beautiful Bill. Taxing foreigners is generally more popular than taxing American citizens. And so we think that it'll pass without amendments. Then what that does is it just puts another lever in the hands of the White House in terms of their negotiations around tariffs and alike. And we have to wait and see as to whether they'll choose to use that lever against a country like Australia. There are certain elements of the Australian tax code which the US administration doesn't necessarily like, so there is some risk that it is applied to a country like Australia, but we'll have to wait and see.
Great. Yeah, so this is obviously an ongoing development. What should investors look out for in the next few weeks or months?
Yeah, so I guess the immediate sort of focus will be on whether the Big Beautiful Bill is passed, and Trump wants that to get through Senate by 4th of July, Independence Day in America. It's probably likely to take longer than that. Might take until August. There is a chance that this particular section isn't actually in the final bill, not because it doesn't have support, but because of the process required to incorporate such a large change to their tax code and the budget reconciliation. So there's a chance that it gets knocked out anyway. But beyond that, we'll be looking to see whether or not the Australian government enters into negotiations with the US on tariffs and tax, and that becomes part of the negotiation process. We also got to think a little bit about whether or not the ATO will step up to the plate in terms of offering a foreign income tax offset, which would help Australians with the fact that this will be a drag on performance. One thing that Australians should take into account, though, I think, is when you're investing in overseas vehicles or investing in managed funds or ETFs that provide access to US assets, sometimes the structure of the fund can make a difference and tax outcomes can change. And so just important that if this does come to law and if we do see it applied against Australia, talk to the provider or the manager of your investment vehicle, your fund or the ETF, just to see what the end implications will be. We'll wait to see what developments come to bear in the next couple of months, and we'll keep the Betashares audience informed.
Well, thanks very much for sharing your insights, Cam, and I hope everyone enjoyed this video. Just a reminder that all information in this video should be considered for general purposes only. It does not take into account the specific circumstances of any individual and should not be used to make an investment decision. But if you wanted more information, please visit www.betashares.com.au, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.